12 years ago, I was kicked out of the company I founded like a piece of trash, and today, they brought me back, with only 90 days left before total bankruptcy. The 7th of July, 1997, I walked through the sunless corridors of Cupertino, wearing faded jeans and a pair of worn-out sneakers. The air inside was suffocating. It smelled of cold coffee and utter defeat. As I passed the employees, I didn't see the energy of a tech giant. I saw a building full of the walking dead. They kept their heads down, avoiding my eyes like I was a priest arriving to conduct a funeral. The board had just fired their fourth high-powered corporate CEO, and, in sheer panic, dumped a dying empire back into my hands. The newspapers were mocking me. Silicon Valley was watching with cold amusement. The elite analysts on Wall Street had already drafted Apple's obituary, in everyone's eyes handing a multi-billion-dollar company on the brink of extinction back to an uneducated, hot-tempered fanatic like me was nothing short of corporate suicide. But Wall Street and those suits on the board got one fundamental thing wrong. They thought Apple was dying of bad sales or a broken cash flow. Apple was suffering from an institutional heart attack. Thousands of brilliant engineers were rotting away in endless internal memos, bloated committee meetings, and self-preserving politics. They weren't thinking about changing the world anymore. They were just trying to write the perfect quarterly report to save their jobs. They didn't need a calculating financial auditor. They needed a madman. I didn't head for the spacious CEO office. Instead, I pushed straight through the doors of the core R&D conference room. The long table was buried under hundreds of pages of market research and dozens of computer prototypes. Apple was trapped in a frenzy of self-destruction. To appease every niche market, we were pumping out dozens of obscure identical products: Macintosh 1400, 3400, 4400, 5400. Even our senior engineers couldn't tell you the difference between them. Behind every product line was a blood-sucking department and a manager fighting tooth and nail for budget. They spent their energy studying what the competition was doing, only to rush out a mediocre copy. They wasted time trying to please everyone, and ended up creating things nobody loved. Everyone stared at me, waiting for an inspiring speech or some grand, holy mission. I said nothing. I walked up to the whiteboard, picked up a thick black marker, and drew 2 bold lines. A simple 2x2 grid. On the horizontal axis I wrote, desktop and portable. On the vertical axis I wrote, pro. My voice wasn't loud, but it hit them like ice water. We need 4 products. 2 for professionals. 2 desktops. Over 3,000 jobs wiped out overnight. In traditional business textbooks, that's called inciting a riot. To Wall Street, it was a psychotic act of self-mutilation. Executives started screaming at me. They told me certain lines still brought in a few million in revenue. They told me layoffs would destroy whatever morale we had left. I looked at them coldly until they finished. If we don't kill them, I said, Apple won't exist in 3 months. Then nobody has a job, nobody has suppliers, and nobody has morale. I knew something they didn't. In a crisis edition, Subtraction is the only blade for survival. When you try to please everyone, you end up losing everything. I didn't need mediocre junk built for a false sense of security. I needed to pour our remaining fire into the few things that could disrupt the world. The grid was drawn, but that was just step 1. Subtraction stopped the bleeding, but it couldn't drag us out of the ICU. We were out of cash. We didn't even have enough to cover payroll for the next 2 months. And that's when I made a decision that made every loyal Apple fan believe I had sold my soul to the devil. I picked up the phone and called Bill Gates back then. To every Apple employee and fan, Bill Gates was the thief who stole our ideas, the invader who took our market, the evil empire that stripped personal computing of its soul. But the business world isn't a fairy tale. There are no absolute gods or demons, only survival and extinction. Gates and I went back and forth for weeks. I told him, Bill, if Apple dies, Microsoft becomes an absolute monopoly. The Department of Justice will tear you apart. You need Apple alive as a competitor, and I need your cash. In the end, we struck a deal that sent shockwaves through the tech world. Microsoft invested $150 million in non-voting Apple stock and promised to keep developing Office for Mac. In return, we dropped our long-standing patent lawsuits and made Internet Explorer the default browser on Mac. In August 1997, I walked onto the stage at Macworld to announce it, when Bill Gates' giant face appeared on the screen behind me via satellite. The crowd of Apple fans and journalists erupted into furious boos, screams, and groans. To them, it was a humiliation, a total surrender, the death of the Apple spirit. I stood at the center of the stage, staring coldly at the angry crowd. I didn't pander to them. I didn't apologize. I looked into the microphone, and said something they couldn't comprehend at the time. If we want Apple to win, we have to do great work. In that moment, everyone thought I was insane, but I was clearer than ever. 12 years of exile hadn't dulled my edge. It had armed me with a brutal sense of realism. I used ruthless cuts to purge our internal rot, and cold compromise to buy the cash flow and time we needed to survive. That grid on the whiteboard didn't just redefine our product line, it drew the line between mediocrity and greatness. On the ruins I had cleared, the noise vanished. The endless cover. Us meetings vanished. All that remained was a dead silence. And a desperate, engineers would assemble the ugly internal components, throw a dull gray plastic box to the designer, and say, "Hey, make this look pretty." But when I walked into Joni's lab and saw his sketches and models, I knew I had found a kindred spirit. Design isn't just what it looks like, I told him. Design is how it works. We aren't building a cold piece of hardware. We're building a partner with a soul. We decided to double down on the bottom right square of the grid, consumer desktop. We were going to build. It couldn't be boring gray or black. It had to be translucent and colorful, letting people see the precision machinery inside. The next 12 months were obsessive obsession for the team. To get that inviting translucent candy look, Joni and his team spent weeks at a candy factory studying the manufacturing of hard candy. To make the internal wiring look as elegant as a piece of art, I forced the engineers to redesign the motherboard a dozen times, even though average users would never open the case or see inside. The engineers thought I was out of my mind, Steve. A great carpenter doesn't use cheap plywood for the back of a cabinet just because nobody sees it. We were dancing on the edge of a cliff, burning through money every second. But this time, nobody was writing quarterly reports. Nobody was passing the buck. May 6, 1998, the Flint Center in Cupertino. This was where I had unveiled the original Macintosh 14 years earlier. Today, I stood on that stage once again. The room was packed with the reporters who had mocked me, the investors who had doubted. The tension in the room was suffocating. I pressed the remote, the stage lights dimmed, and a single spotlight focused on an object draped in silk. This was the iMac no gray plastic. No complex ports. I even eliminated the floppy drive that dominated the industry. It had one power cord and a built-in modem designed to get users onto the emerging web in 3 simple steps. The room went dead silent for 3 seconds. Then, it erupted into a deafening roar of applause that nearly tore the roof off. Looking at the tears in the eyes of my engineers, I knew we had survived. The iMac sold over 800,000 units in its first year, shattering Apple sales records. We pulled back from the edge of bankruptcy, and that simple 2x2 grid eventually evolved into the iPod, the iPhone, and the iPad. Years later, people love to look back at 1997 as a stroke of genius or a miraculous corporate fairy tale. The greatest comeback story in business history wasn't one with massive capital or lofty slogans. It was one because when faced with total destruction, someone was willing to use the coldest blade to cut away mediocrity. It was one because someone was willing to sacrifice cheap pride to buy the right to survive. It was one because I had the courage to cut away every distraction at the edge of the cliff and jump into the unknown.